Hello. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zoe Shine, and on behalf of the National Juvenile Justice Network and the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, I want to welcome you to this webinar, which is titled The JJDPA Updating Federal Law to Reflect New Reforms. Before we can get started, I just have a few things to run through about the webinar software. I'm sure you've probably heard this before, but bear with me. So when you enter the conference, please make sure that you've enabled your audio. You have the option of joining the discussion via telephone or using your computer speakers and microphone. Generally, the best method is to call in using the phone number listed in your control panel, enter the access ID, and the audio pin also listed in your control panel. Because we have so many people on the webinar, everyone is muted to ensure we don't have distracting background noise. On your screen in the upper right-hand corner, you should see a control panel. If you want to minimize that during the presentation, click on the orange arrow and the panel will be hidden. Click on it again and it will expand to its full size. If you have a question during the presentation, simply type it into the question box to send it to the panelists. In the interest of time, most questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And if we don't have time to get through all of the questions, presenters may be willing to provide some written responses afterward. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available online in the next day or two. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Naomi Smoot, who is a Senior Policy Associate at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. She assists in the development and implementation of nationwide initiatives in juvenile justice leadership and reform with Coalition for Juvenile Justice state members, as well as state and national partners. She's also involved in field development and outreach. Take it away, Naomi.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start off by reading the bios of our two speakers who have graciously agreed to take part in our webinar. We're going to be hearing today from Robert Bob Schwartz, who co-founded the Juvenile Law Center in 1975, a year after the JJDPA was first enacted. He's been executive director since 1982. Bob was also a gubernatorial appointee to the Commission's Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Committee, which is the state advisory group for Pennsylvania. He served on that panel from 1991 to 2012. Lara Quint will also be speaking with us today. Lara serves as legislative counsel for U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island. Lara has worked on legislative reform in a number of areas, including juvenile justice. Prior to working on the Hill, she was an assistant federal public defender in Washington, D.C. As you know, today we're going to be talking about the JJDPA, which, next slide, please, Zoe, which turned 40 back in September of last year. The Act provides a lot of important protections for our youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system. And last year, in December 11th, 2014, Senator Whitehouse and Senator Charles Grassley, a Republican from Iowa, introduced a bill that would update the JJDPA. This was a very important moment for juvenile justice because it's been something that the advocacy community has been working on for quite some time. The JJDPA was last reauthorized in 2002, as you're going to hear more about from Bob in a moment. And the bill, S2999, would strengthen the core protections that are afforded to youth in the JJDPA and update the bill to recognize a lot of changes and new information that's been gathered over the past decade. And folks in the advocacy community are hopeful that this bill will serve as the basis of new legislation that will be introduced in the 114th Congress this year. Bob is going to start us off by talking about some history and background. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Naomi, and hello to all of you who are participating. I'm sure I know quite a few of you, and thank you for jumping in. My goal in the few minutes that I have is to talk a bit about the 1974 Act and its structure and what Congress hoped to get in passing this law, and bring us a little bit up to 2002 to set the stage for the reauthorization that Lara will talk about after me, with the bill introduced by Senators Whitehouse and Grassley. Now, I think for me, it's been fascinating to go back and look at what Congress found and decided was important in 1974. The bill has been reauthorized several times since then, and it's interesting how congressional findings change to reflect the temper of the times, the latest passions, the latest myths, the latest fads that Congress felt that states should devote their dollars to. The findings lead to changes in what states must do to comply with the law, and there are several components of what states must do that must be in their state plans that are tied to funding themselves. The irony, of course, is that while Congress allows states to devote money to many, many areas, few of those areas are tied directly to funding requirements like the core requirements, which I'll get to in a minute. JJDPA has reporting, oversight, and technical assistance responsibilities that are laid out in the Act and have been from the beginning. The very first law established the Office of Juvenile Justice, created the administrator's position, and set forth the duties that have ebbed and flowed in the legislation since then, and it created an advisory group for each state. The state advisory group responsibilities has generally stayed the same. The composition has fluctuated a little bit. And for example, in 1974, the state advisory group members could be no fewer than 21 or no more than 33. It's still 33 at the upper end, but now it could be as few as 15. In 1974, a third of the members of the SAG had to be under age 26. Now 20% have to be under age 24. And 3 of them actually have to be in the supervision of the system. Next slide, please. So the bill was passed, and it was an interesting passage. Birch Bayh was the primary sponsor of the bill, the senator from Indiana. But one of the clever things that happened was that advocates made sure that this was not a left-wing or a right-wing bill, but it was a bill that had support from not only both sides of the aisle, but from all aspects of the political spectrum. So it's interesting that a lot of effort at the time was gotten to get support for this legislation from groups like the American Legion, which had, I think, probably more political clout 50 years ago than it does today, as well as groups like the Boys and Girls Clubs, American Bar, and ACLU. Next slide. So the Act originally did a couple of things. One, and I'll get more deeply into this in a moment, it established a formula grants program tied to poverty levels, population levels, delinquency rates, and other factors that varied by state. That's Title II of the Act that arranges for the allocation of dollars to the different states based on the formula. Some states get a lot more money under that formula than other states do. The law addressed one of the problems that was a big one of concern for Congress in 1974, and that was separating kids from adults in jails and prisons and deinstitutionalizing status offenses, which was a national scandal at the time. Runaways, truants, kids who were ungovernable were routinely treated as delinquent youth and usually spent a lot more time incarcerated than kids who were arrested and adjudicated delinquent for more serious offenses. Next slide, please. The congressional findings, as I mentioned, have also varied with the times. So in 1974, an example of the findings that led to the passage of the Act are the ones that are on this slide. The fact that there are a lot of factors that lead to delinquency, that current programs have failed to address delinquency, and for those of you old enough to remember, in the early 70s, late 60s, the issue of drug use was of particular concern, and that was at attention of Congress in passing this law. There were also, I might add, there were lots of runaways. A lot of that was tied to drug use, kids who went from places like Philadelphia to Haight-Ashbury were of concern to Congress. So this bill also in Title III created the Runaway Youth Act that addressed problems of kids who ran away from home. I put number 5 here as a finding because it's fascinating to see that in 1974, Congress was concerned about unnecessary exclusion of kids from school, what today we call the school-to-prison pipeline, what we were speaking about 15 years ago in terms of zero tolerance policies. But even in the mid-70s, there was an issue that needed to be addressed, and Congress thought that this law could address unnecessary exclusion of kids from school. Next slide, please. So, by the way, those findings have varied as the law gets reauthorized. So, whereas in 1974, Congress found that juveniles accounted for half of all serious crime in the United States, by 2002, Congress could say that although juvenile violent crime arrest rate in '99 was the lowest in the decade, there remains a consensus that it's still too high. So you could, I guess, make whatever findings you want to justify whatever you're doing, but the findings in 2002 also recognized that girls were entering the system, that families needed to be addressed, and that there needed to be a balance between prevention and intervention. So the purpose of the act in '74 then was to get money to states to address juvenile delinquency in a whole host of ways that would be addressed through the state planning requirement. But again, this framing of the school-to-prison pipeline issue in 1974 disappeared in subsequent reauthorizations of the law. But it's also true that state advisory groups weren't paying a lot of attention to this even after the '74 Act. And as I mentioned, the Runaway Youth Act was part of this as well. And that was the result of the finding, this finding number 7. The next slide. So Congress concluded its declared policy with this slide. Preventing, reducing delinquency, effective programs to divert youth, and to provide alternatives to institutionalization. And I included this as a reminder again that in this country we have frequently talked about diversion. We have frequently talked about alternatives to incarceration. That has been federal policy for almost 40 years. Having the policy and even the dollars available to implement the policy doesn't mean that it gets done. So as we think about reauthorization this year, one of the interesting questions, well, how do we, out of this Christmas tree of possibilities, all the ornaments that get put into the state plan, we get a focus on things like diversion or deinstitutionalization. Next slide, please. The state plan requirement in Title II of the formula grant piece is, I think, the most important part of this legislation. It has remained in structure fairly constant through every reauthorization, so that the states submit a plan to the Justice Department and JJDPA, which approves the plan that leads to the distribution of federal funds. In the plan, there are all sorts of things that the states should address, and there are some things that the states must address, and that's been true for the last 40 years. Next slide, please. So the state plans must include not less than 75% of the funds to go to, and in '74 they referred to advanced techniques. By later reauthorizations, that terminology disappeared, but still roughly 75% of the formula grants must go to programming and services to do things like this. In '74, it was to divert juveniles from the system, again, community-based alternatives. highly ironic we're still working on that 40 years later. The techniques that they speak about include the next slide. And again, the emphasis on community-based programming to me is, I think, revelatory, because it was the mid-1970s, right about in the year or two after this law was passed, that states began clamping down on kids in ways that have not been healthy for children or for families or for state budgets. But that was right in the face of federal policy. And I also would add that this is the major law on juvenile justice policy in the United States. You know, when folks from other countries ask what happens in the United States, what's juvenile justice policy in the United States, to the extent we have anything like federal policy, this is it. So advanced techniques continue on the next slide, please. So you see that the idea behind this law in '74 was to put into place local bureaus, community-based programming, drug and alcohol programming, and education programs to keep kids in school and to discourage removal and exclusion from school. And also, even in '74, we had in federal law the idea that kids' voice mattered and that youth should be initiating programs. Next slide. Interestingly enough, the law urged states to develop financial incentives or disincentives to meet the policy goals of the law. There have been states that have done that better than others, like Ohio, Illinois, more recently California with its realignment of funding, but this has not been the norm. Next slide. Also in Section 223, the state plan requirement in Sections 12 and 13 were the first two core protections of the Act, the first two of what became four core requirements, providing in those days within 2 years of enactment that kids shouldn't be in criminal facilities and should be separated from adults, and that that you should also the status offenses kids should not be incarcerated for status offenses. Those were the first two big ones, and I'm going to move a little more quickly through some other requirements in later amendments. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that 1977 this law was amended to increase and expand the institutionalization of status offenders and the separation requirements. By '80, we were actively working to get kids out of jails regardless of whether there was separation, get them out entirely. That was amended and enhanced a few years later. Next slide, please. In '88, Congress addressed disproportionate minority confinement for the first time. As you'll see, by 2002, that became a disproportionate minority contact. It was elevated to a core requirement. And also in 1992, the Title V Incentive Grants Program, which was a very, very important program through the 1990s in giving states additional dollars to experiment with prevention programs and giving states targets. It was like the race to the top in a different format. Next slide, please. So for me, having served on Pennsylvania's state advisory group for over 20 years and being around almost at the beginning of this law, there are a few takeaways about what the potential is for a bill or a law of this kind. I think it is really important that it does establish national values and addresses the temper of the times. So later authorizations are passage of JJDPA included addressing girls, including addressing mental health issues and families in different ways. Talked about positive youth development for the first time, talked about reentry for the first time, and put that on the map for state advisory groups. We've seen a great variety of quality and insight in state advisory groups around the country, but there's no question that state advisory groups can be and must be the vehicle for furthering the national values at the state level and making wise distributions of these federal dollars. We've seen states across the country, from Illinois to New York, revisiting the composition of their state advisory groups in ways that have been really, really healthy and exciting for the field. And we've seen other states that barely pay attention to the values behind the law, where the state advisory groups are less attentive than many of their counterparts. Strong state advisory groups have found ways to partner with other state agencies, because the reality is that there aren't that many dollars here, and we expect these dollars to go a long way. Mixing and matching dollars from state and other federal funding streams has proven to be valuable, and some SAGs have partnered with foundations. I wrote a monograph that is on our Juvenile Law Center website a couple of years ago about Pennsylvania's partnership with MacArthur Foundation, where our state advisory group put in a good $10 million into juvenile justice reform, matching MacArthur's models for change dollars in the state dollar for dollar. And by having our state advisory group engaged, we had state leadership engaged in a way that sustained the foundation reform beyond what the foundation on its own could possibly have expected. So that there are, this law does a lot of very good things. We struggle to have it reauthorized in modern terms, and Lara will talk about the latest effort to bring JJDPA up to date.
Hi, are you ready for me?
Yep.
Thanks so much, Naomi and CJJ, for inviting me to participate in this call, and for all your help last year on getting the bill that everyone's been mentioning ready. I'm sure I also know several of you in the room, and I'm sure you've also helped me. So thank you. The bill that S-2999 was a labor of love that was a year in the making last year. Senator Whitehouse and Senator Grassley introduced JJDPA reauthorization. I think it was the last week of session in December. And right before the commitment was that whoever won the election in November, we would continue working and introduce something bipartisan as a marker that for starting the 114th Congress. So we were able to do that. I did want to highlight some aspects of the bill, and I'd be happy to answer more detailed questions either later this hour or personally. So as the first slide shows, as far as the core protections go, we did make efforts to strengthen the core protections in JJDPA reauthorization. Sight and sound contact, while the current bill, most recently reauthorized in 2002, that protection or that requirement that youth be separated in sight and sound from adult inmates only applies obviously to convicted individuals, and we've expanded that in the current bill to include pretrial youth awaiting trial, basically, in the system. So we think that's strengthening. Next slide, please. We also thought it was very important, based on feedback from the field, to strengthen and clarify the racial and ethnic disparities core protection. So the first thing we did was actually identify what that meant for purposes of the bill. So it's highlighted as a definition in the first section of the bill. And we also made reporting requirements. We asked states to come up with plans to reduce and address ethnic and racial disparities, to identify the different parts of the system where they are happening, and to report on what they're finding. So we hope that the increased clarity and transparency can also lead to better results. The next slide, please. Finally, in terms of the core protections, another element that has been mentioned that is strengthened is the phase out of the VCO, which was the exception to the ban on incarcerating status offenders. As you all know, until now, if it's a valid court order that says that an offender cannot commit certain status offenses, and then the youth commits those offenses, and because it's a violation of a court order, it's kind of a loophole, and so they have been able to be incarcerated under that exception. A lot of states some states do not use the VCO anymore, as you know. Most states have decreased use of it, even among those that still use it. And this bill is consistent with an amendment that went through in 2009 in the last reauthorization that would give states 3 years to phase out the use of that VCO. And then obviously there is an exception for hardship if states face particular hardships. The idea is give states some time to find alternatives. We know that some judges rely on the VCO for reasons that are understandable when you hear them talk about it, that they don't know, they're worried about youth hurting themselves or hurting others, and they just don't know where to put them. We know that there are alternatives that are safe and that are actually more effective. And I think studies, even very recent studies from Texas, show that. But it's intended to give states some time to come into compliance. Next slide, please. As far as new elements in the bill, one, I think the biggest thing we tried to do is really, since the bill hasn't been reauthorized since 2002, so that's 14 years, even though it's 40 years old, I think the biggest developments are in the scientific community and the consensus that adolescent brains develop very differently from adult brains, and so we tried to incorporate everything we've learned, well, not everything, but a lot of what we've learned into the bill. So it recognizes the role of science, and it recognizes the role of trauma and how many of these kids have been exposed to violence or witnessed to violence. So it requires states and JJDPA to consider scientific developments and the role of trauma when making their plans. And it also requires screening and anyone who comes into contact with these kids, with youth in the system, to be trauma informed in their treatment, in their screening, in their practice. Other new, we don't have a slide for every new issue, but some things I wanted to flag were that there are provisions to decrease for states to decrease the use of dangerous practices, including tear gas, restraints. I think we phrase it as dangerous restraints and practices. And in addition to having a plan to reduce the use of those with youth, there's a reporting requirement so that we can see how those efforts are going. We also have some school-related updates to the bill, which involve transfer of credits, things that may seem like a small deal, but we consistently hear from education communities and the juvenile justice community that when kids are in the system, even if it's very temporary, the fact that credits are not easily transferable makes it all that much harder for them to re-enter the community. So that's one thing we have. We also have a requirement that, which should be happening already and probably is in many states, but that the JJ systems really work with the state educational systems. Kids are entitled, obviously, to public education, and when they go to facilities, they should have access to education that is close to par, or it should be on par, but they should be getting adequate education. So, and we should help help those youth who are transitioning back into the communities. Those are the main new big picture changes. I think there's also stronger language in terms of making sure that the youth have access to effective assistance of counsel, which was already in the bill, I think, to some extent, but not as specific. The other big changes are accountability and transparency provisions. Largely, we agree with them, but largely they're Senator Grassley's kind of signature accountability provisions that were, some of you may have seen in VAWA reauthorization. So audits being required of OJJDP and states, and more transparency in terms of state compliance and numbers of facilities and how they're complying with the bill. And the other change is in funding. Obviously, it's not one that states will be happy with. We weren't happy with it. I think that there's a concern that authorizations in this new Congress, and obviously Senator Grassley is the chairman of Judiciary, that authorizations should not be above currently appropriated levels. Unfortunately, JJDPA its funding has dropped sharply in the last years, and we're aware of that. So there's the way the funding is written in the new bill, and I'm sorry, you can move to the next slide, is that it's a funding for the bill as in its entirety, because some sections have not been appropriated in the last 10 years, and we obviously did not want to deauthorize them, but we gave an overall funding level and then capped the amount of that could go to mentoring programs in the hopes that we would shift some higher funding to state grants in Title II and to Title V. So again, feel free to ask any more specific questions. I'm happy to share. I mean, it's online, but I have a red line of the bill and what we're trying to change compared to current law. I don't know exactly what changes there will be this year. I think there will be some changes. I've had initial conversations with Chairman Grassley's staff, and they're very committed to introducing a bill soon and to getting it marked up soon. And they are talking about March or April. So the chairman is very committed to this issue, and obviously Senator Whitehouse is as well. There may be some changes. I don't know what all of those will be, but I'm happy to be in touch with everyone about those. And we need to get more support on the committee. The goal is, Chairman Grassley has said he wants 4 Republicans on the bill in order to move forward to a markup. He's confident that that will happen if there's a bill that he can live with. He thinks we can get 4. And I think that most of the Democrats on the committee will co-sponsor the legislation as well. So I think that's where things stand on the Senate side. I've had some conversations with House Education and the Workforce Committee, where Bobby Scott is the new ranking member, and he would like to introduce a bill that that matches the Senate bill, whatever we come up with here. So yet to find Republicans on the House side, but that's the picture from the Hill.
Thanks, Lara. Next slide, please, Zoe. So before we go to questions, we wanted to give you sort of some information about some SAG-specific changes that are included in S2999. As many of you know, CJJ is a membership organization. We have a network of advocates across the country. There are 7,000 members, most of which are state advisory groups. So these changes are really important to a lot of our members. The first one that you'll see listed here is that there's some changes in composition of who should be on a SAG to include defense counsel for youth, experts in truancy, and victim advocates. And experts in truancy, as many of you probably know, state advisory groups, a number of them are already working on truancy-related issues and how to keep kids who have engaged in status offense behaviors out of the juvenile justice system. So having these voices on the SAG would help facilitate further change in that area. Also, one of the things that we hear from our members quite often is that they struggle with finding enough youth members, and also that we really want to engage as many youth as we can, that the youth voice is vital, and that it's an important perspective to have, especially since we're dealing with issues that these young people have faced for themselves, and that we might not understand to the same degree that they do. So this would change the youth membership from 24, the current language is 24 at time of appointment, and the new language that was included in S2999 would be 28, would be the membership for youth members, the age. It also requires, the new bill would require posting of 3-year plans on public websites. Right now, as many of you know, state advisory groups are required to submit a 3-year plan to their governor. This would assist with transparency and give the public access to information about a lot of the programs that state advisory groups are funding and the priorities that they're establishing for their individual states in the area of juvenile justice. And before we wrap up and head into questions, I just wanted to thank Lara again for all her hard work in getting S2999 introduced. At the end of the session last year, about 100 national groups, including both CJJ and our partner in sponsoring this event, NJJN, signed on in support of S2999. Some of our state advisory groups did as well. And if you're interested in finding additional information about the JJDPA, either in its initial format or in its proposed form for the 113th Congress, I encourage you to visit either CJJ's website, juvejustice.org, or actforjj.org. Act4JJ is a working group of the National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Council that helps advocate for reauthorization of the JJDPA. And I think we have some time for questions left over now. Oh, and also, there's our contact information for Lara and Bob and myself if you have any more specific questions that you'd like to send directly to any of us.
We have one question from Nikki Olson, which is, will parents be on the state advisory group?
Parents are, I mean, Naomi, you may be able to speak better, or Bob, about whether they are in practice. They certainly could be, as it's written now. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yes, they can be, but it's not. I don't think it hasn't been mandated. I didn't know whether I didn't see whether it was mandated in the new bill.
It's not mandated. It's just our understanding has been that they are allowed, and I'm open to if people think, you know, that we should phrase it differently. That's we're certainly open to it. We did not make any changes to that.
And if you're an attendee, just remember that if you have a question, you can just type it right into the question box and we'll read it out. We have another question, which is, what, if any, added accountability requirements are included in the new bill related to compliance, including DMC?
Okay, so the racial and ethnic disparities piece, states now have to develop plans to improve the situation. And they also have to develop data and analysis systems to identify where racial and ethnic disparities exist in the system and to track those disparities. They also have to report on an annual basis any progress or efforts they've made in data collection and developing measurable outcomes for racial and ethnic disparities. In terms of more general accountability language, there's a lot, and it involves audits. It involves, again, this is Grassi's language from VAWA and other bills. It's basically audits, more public reporting on the website in terms of what states are doing to comply with their state plans, and there are also limits on how much states can spend, or DOJ or JJDP can spend on conferences. There's an annual report on all expenditures. There are lobbying prohibitions. I'm happy to send, it's a long section that kind of requires audits to see what kind of expenditures were authorized, whether salaries and benefits were supported by documentation about need, whether contract bids were in accordance with guidelines. It's very specific, and that is, we are okay with it, but it's not changeable in the sense that that's Senator Grassi felt very strongly that if he was going to co-sponsor this bill, he wanted this language in it.
We have a few more questions coming in. We have one that's for Lara, asking if you can say a bit more about the reallocation of some of the JJDPA funds away from mentoring. How successful have the mentoring investments been in the past, and why the heavy emphasis there?
For me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I mean, this is pretty in the weeds, but basically when we were negotiating authorization levels and trying to match authorization levels with current appropriation levels, we saw that a lot of sections of JJDPA as written had not been appropriated. And what had been appropriated very specifically in appropriations bills had been Title II, Title V, and then mentoring, which is not a section of JJDPA, obviously, but it added a lot of money. The mentoring has gotten a lot more than other programs in recent years. And because it's a purpose area, we added that to the total available for JJDPA. And I think that Senator Hatch and others had been initially very interested in mentoring. I know my boss still supports it, and in fact just did a resolution on Mentoring Month. But this was based on feedback from the field that we got, both from NSA report and other briefings, that mentoring seemed to not, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, it was not getting the bang for the buck that they thought some other programs might. And so the idea that mentoring had been getting $100,000 while Title V had been getting, $100 million, while Title V had been getting $50 million, seemed a little bit out of whack, because states can certainly use some of the money for mentoring, but if it's under Title II, they can use it for other purposes as well.
Thanks, Lara. We have another question from Lance White, which is, given the new guidance from OJJDP, will there be any work to clarify what the intent of the law is with regards to jail removal, detained versus secure detention of juveniles? It seems like this would be best to have lawmakers address specifically rather than leaving it up to administrators to define.
That makes sense. I have not thought about it. I think maybe, is that more for committee report language? Probably than the bill, but if you have ideas, I probably should look at the exact guidance you're talking about. But we have not thought about it, but I think that it makes sense either for the bill or for any accompanying report.
This one's from Jim Moser, who says, audits is a general term that clearly implies added work for presumably both federal and state folks, presumably with no added funding. Is that realistic, and what will be expected?
I hear you. Auditing does involve work, so it's the Inspector General of DOJ who's required to audit recipients of grants. Basically, the bill gives the IG the power to determine a number of grantees to be audited every year. I don't know exactly how much that would cost. That is absolutely more work. We see that in other bills, and I think that to the extent that some of you in the field feel that that is more work that would, or have a sense of how much funding it would require, please let us know. Let Senator Grassi's staff know and hear your thoughts on that portion.
On a similar note from Danny Turek, is there a proposed audit format tool, and how often are they required?
That is left to the IG to determine right now in the current draft. Basically the IG can determine how many organizations should be audited, but it's there's a 2-year fiscal period in which if you're audited and found to be out of compliance, then it cannot receive certain grants for 2 years. Or it's not it cannot receive, but it won't be prioritized. It's really, and I'm not meaning to not answer. It's just very, very specific and technical language, and I think it's not negotiable based on what we've been told. I think that if you have thoughts on the monetary aspect of it, please let the relevant people know.
And we at CJJ would welcome feedback on that point as well from our members and from other folks in the field who have information on how much this would cost and whether or not it's feasible given the realities and constraints of staffing.
Yeah, no, that would be very helpful. Again, it's DOJ that's doing the auditing, but obviously they would spend money on that.
We have a question from Larry Vanderbilt, which is, how is the separation requirement in the JJDPA attempting to coordinate its requirements with that of PREA, separation of under 18 from 18 and older?
It's drafted consistent with PREA. It matches PREA and other everything that has passed recently. We went through with Legislative Council to make sure we're consistent.
What, if any, added requirements are included in the new bill regarding how money can be spent by states?
Requirements. The new requirements on states would be related to disproportionate minority contact, as you've discussed, kind of reporting on that, strengthening the reporting on reducing the dangerous restraints and practices. But in terms of other new requirements, I think compared to current law, the assistance of counsel is kind of more of a core, but we didn't change any of the other. I mean, they have to take into account science, and I'm sorry, I'm not understanding how broad the question is, but to the extent requirements are changed, they're strengthened, and I think they're clarified, but we don't have a whole lot of new requirements on states.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Feel free to just type them in. We have a clarification. Jim Moser says the question on requirements regarding funding relates to how narrowly or broadly language like evidence-based programs is interpreted.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. That's interesting, actually. Evidence-based was brought to our attention as one of the possible changes that our co-sponsors may want to make this time around in terms of a definition of evidence-based. Right now, the definition of evidence-based is that it's optimally through randomized trials, I think. Let me see.
Yeah, it means a program or practice that is demonstrated to be effective in that A is based on a clearly articulated and empirically supported theory, has measurable outcomes, including a detailed description of what outcomes were produced in a particular population, and has been scientifically tested optimally through randomized control studies or comparison group studies. And that's in the definition sections of the bill.
Thank you. And we've had some questions about whether it should be optimally through randomized control studies or just through randomized control studies. So that definition may change, but the other A, B, and C, A and B won't.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? If not, we have one more comment from Josh Rovner who says, please be sure to mention that Bob has announced his retirement and how much we'll miss his leadership.
Well,
Thanks, Josh.
It's not for another 9 months, so you won't miss me for a while. But thank you.
If there are no more questions from the audience, we'll just say thank you so much for joining us. The contact information, again, is on the screen if you need to contact any of the speakers for any reason. The recording and the PowerPoint will be available online from NJJN and CJJ early next week, so look out for that. And thanks again for joining us.